Hello, my name is Erik Brockbank, and this is a pre-recorded talk for CogSci 2020. My talk today is Explanation Supports Hypothesis Generation in Learning. So a large body of research has shown that simply generating an explanation while learning supports the learning process by promoting abstraction and generalization in the task. So 3 and 4-year-olds who are prompted to explain why certain objects activate a Blickett detector are more likely to recognize a causal relationship that goes against their perceptual biases. And 5 and 6-year-olds who are prompted to explain key events in a story are better able to abstract the moral of it. Interestingly, these results generalize to adults as well. So adolescents form more general causal models of the circulatory system when they're prompted to self-explain during learning. And adults learning completely new categories, like these robots on the right, are more likely to recognize the abstract principle underlying their categorization if they explain during learning. So why does this happen? Recent research has proposed that people's notion of a good explanation is one that is consistent with explanatory virtues. So a good explanation is generalizable, it's abstract, and it's consistent with prior knowledge. The idea is that explaining during the learning process helps guide learners towards accounts of the data that are consistent with those virtues. So this account offers a compelling answer to the why question about explanation, i.e. why it supports abstraction. In the current study, we address the how question. How does explanation facilitate abstraction and generalization during learning? So what does it mean to address the how question? Well, one way to make some theoretical headway on this question is to distinguish between hypothesis generation and hypothesis evaluation. So if people are performing a task that involves learning something new, like which of these robots are glorps, they need to generate the proper hypothesis and then evaluate whether it's consistent with the data. Prior work by Bonowitz and Griffiths looked at this distinction during a rule learning task like the one on the right, where participants saw a series of examples of blocks lighting up and had to figure out the underlying rule about which blocks caused others to light up. In one condition, participants were given a strong prime beforehand that would help them discover the rule. Critically, participants in this experiment performed separate hypothesis generation and evaluation tasks. So after seeing all the evidence, they were first asked to simply provide their best guess about what rule determined which blocks lit up the others. This was hypothesis generation. Then they were prompted to rate various candidate hypotheses for the data they had seen. This was hypothesis evaluation. The authors show that the prime affected the hypotheses participants generated, but had no impact on their hypothesis evaluation. So returning to the original question, our experiment used a similar paradigm to ask whether explanation primarily impacts hypothesis generation or evaluation. On the one hand, it's possible that explanation helps participants generate the target hypothesis, but has no impact on evaluation, similar to the effects of priming I just described. On the other hand, it could be that explainers aren't any more likely to generate the target hypothesis, but consider it more likely during evaluation. Or it could be a combination of both. In the current experiment, we test these possibilities with a novel category learning task performed with adults. In this experiment, participants' job was to figure out which lure combinations caught fish and which ones didn't. The experiment had 3 phases, which I'll walk through in more detail. First, participants were shown evidence that would allow them to learn the rule about which lures caught fish. Then they were prompted to generate hypotheses about the most likely rule. And finally, they performed a hypothesis evaluation task in which they rated how good various rules were for distinguishing which lure combinations catch fish. So first, I'll walk through the stimuli participants saw during the task. Above is the full set of fishing lures participants saw over the course of the learning phase. Lures had a top and bottom shape, a top and bottom color, and a purple dot that was present or absent from each shape. There were 6 shapes, 3 rounded, 3 pointy, and 4 colors. So this is the full parameter space of our fishing lure universe. This image will be visible on various slides throughout the remainder of the talk, so don't feel like you have to memorize it. So which lures caught fish was determined by the target rule shown here, which we chose after initial piloting because it's consistent with explanatory virtues. It's abstract and draws on prior knowledge about the mechanism for catching fish. Note that there are other rules which account for this evidence as well, and which participants might have come up with instead, something we return to in the hypothesis evaluation component. However, our expectation was that this rule would be particularly salient for explainers. As a reminder, the goal wasn't to show that explainers can perform better at identifying this rule, but to figure out what it is they're doing, generating this hypothesis, evaluating it more highly, or both. So here's the procedure, beginning with the learning phase or evidence trials. There were 8 evidence trials, each of which had 3 parts. First, participants were shown an example fishing lure combination and told whether or not it caught fish, as in the screen shown here. Next, they were asked to either explain or describe the evidence they had seen, as shown here for the explanation condition. In the control describe condition, participants were asked to describe this lure combination that your friend caught a fish with. This manipulation was the only difference between the two conditions. Finally, participants were asked to make a prediction about a new fishing lure combination they had not seen previously, as shown here. So evidence from previous trials was visible throughout the trial phase and accumulated as participants went along. There were 4 lures that caught fish and 4 that didn't. The order was the same across conditions. So after participants had seen all 8 evidence trials, they were given 2 prompts that elicited the hypotheses they had generated during the trials. The first, shown on the left, was a free response prompt that asked them to provide the best rule they had come up with about which lures caught fish. On the right was a classification task, which presented participants with 8 novel lures and asked them to identify which ones would likely catch fish. The evidence they had seen during the trials was not visible during this phase. We were just eliciting the hypotheses they had generated already. Critically, we're comparing the 2 conditions here to see whether explanation produced a difference in hypothesis generation across these 2 tasks. So finally, after the hypothesis generation prompts, participants were asked to evaluate different candidate hypotheses for how good they were as explanations of which lures caught fish. So here you can see a sample rule evaluation prompt for the target hypothesis. The evidence was visible during this phase because we didn't want people's judgments about how good an explanation was to be confounded by their memory of the evidence. So when we say evaluate here, the idea is simply to elicit people's posterior judgments of whether an explanation is good in light of the explanation itself, as well as the evidence presented for it. So people evaluated a set of 6 rules in this way. In the table at left, we show a sample of these rules, starting with the target rule from earlier. We also prompted evaluations for a distractor rule, which was consistent with all the evidence as well, but considerably more complex. Then the 4 remaining rules were chosen to vary in their consistency with the evidence, but were all less parsimonious than the target and distractor. So we show an example here in the table. Here again, we're comparing the 2 conditions to see whether explanation impacts hypothesis evaluation. We're primarily interested in people's evaluations of the target rule, but we're also going to compare the ratings for the distractor rule. We hypothesized that explainers might rate the distractor rule lower than control participants, since the distractor rule is consistent with all the evidence but considerably less generalizable, and therefore doesn't exhibit explanatory virtues despite being just as likely as the target rule. So once participants had completed the evaluation component, there was a brief memory probe, which I'll discuss later on. So now I'll walk through the results, first looking at the role of explanation in hypothesis generation, and then turning to the effect on hypothesis evaluation. These results are based on 43 undergraduate participants in each condition. So first, we ask whether explanation supports hypothesis generation. Here, we look at how people in each condition performed on the classification task shown at the left. We plot mean accuracy on this task for each condition. If explainers were more likely to generate the correct hypothesis, they should have higher accuracy. And that's what we find here. Explainers were significantly more accurate on this task, suggesting that explanation supports the hypothesis generation process that enables classifying novel lures. So next, we look at performance on the free response prompt shown at left, where participants were asked to provide their best rule for which lures caught fish. Responses were coded as either correct or incorrect, and the criterion was whether participants would accurately classify a novel lure based on what they'd written. A second rater blind to the task coded responses, and agreement was 99%. So many participant answers directly corresponded to the target rule or were very similar. Here I'll review a few others which are informative about how we coded them. So here's one example answer. The bottom part of the lure must have more than one side, so a square, a rectangle, a triangle, for instance. If it does not, then it cannot catch fish in the lake. So in this case, the participant didn't say pointy shape, but said something that would allow them to accurately classify any new lures, so it was counted as correct. Here's another response. The single best rule I used was if the lure combinations were of a circular main body and triangle attachment. In this case, the participant may have in fact meant something more general than just triangles, because they were 100% accurate on the classification task. However, their response was coded as incorrect because this rule would not allow somebody to accurately classify new lure combinations. So to compare the 2 conditions, we're going to plot the percent of people in each condition that generated the correct rule. If explainers were more likely to generate the correct hypothesis, they should have higher accuracy on this task as well. And that's what we find here. So explainers are significantly more likely, this time by a wide margin, to provide the correct rule when prompted. So in the earlier classification task, participants may have been able to do reasonably well without fully grasping the rule, whereas in the free response prompt, participants had to have an explicit formulation of the rule, which might explain the larger effect here. But taking these results together, we find that explainers are more likely to generate the target hypothesis. In other words, Both measures presented here suggest that explaining intervenes at the level of hypothesis generation. Next, we look at how participants in each condition performed on the hypothesis evaluation task. In other words, does explanation support hypothesis evaluation? Here, we compare people's ratings for the target, distractor, and all other rules combined. A higher rating, as indicated by the example on the left, indicates that participants believed it was a better rule. If explanation played a role in hypothesis evaluation, we should see differences across conditions in how they evaluate these rules. We were interested in ratings of the target rule, both across conditions and relative to the other rules, as well as distractor rule ratings across the two conditions, since this might provide an additional lens for understanding how explanation impacts hypothesis evaluation. So here's what we find. At a high level, participants in both conditions rated the target rule significantly higher than all other rules, including the distractor rule. So this suggests that participants in both conditions found the target rule to be much more compelling than the others. The difference between conditions in their rating of the distractor rule was not significant. So if explainers found the distractor rule less compelling because of its lack of generalizability, we don't see that here. However, there was a significant difference between conditions in their rating of the target rule on the far right. So this suggests that explanation may play a role in hypothesis evaluation as well. We note, however, that the evaluations for the target rule were near ceiling, so it's a bit challenging to interpret this effect. At a high level, we suggest that explanation may play a role in hypothesis evaluation, but this difference between conditions and target rule evaluation merits further consideration, which we address in future work. So before moving on, it's worth considering several other potential explanations for our results. First, is it possible explainers perform better on hypothesis generation simply as a result of greater task engagement? We look at this by comparing performance on a memory probe after the task, shown at right. Participants were shown 8 lures, 4 of which were presented during the evidence trials and 4 of which were completely novel. They were asked to indicate whether they had seen these lures previously. So if explainers were more engaged during the evidence trials, they should remember task stimuli better. So we compare the two conditions for their accuracy on the memory probe task. We find that participants perform above chance in both conditions, but there's no significant difference in performance between the two conditions. So this suggests that our generation and evaluation results are not explained by differential task engagement. Another important consideration is whether explainers perform better on hypothesis generation as a result of longer task engagement. So if explainers spend more time on their explanations or simply more time considering the stimuli, this might have helped them generate the target hypothesis independent of the explanation prompts. We look at this by comparing time on the experiment overall and average time on evidence trials, which was the only component that differed across conditions. If explainers spent longer on the experiment or on evidence trials, that might explain the generation results we obtained. We can see here that participants in both conditions spent similar amounts of time on both the evidence trials and the task overall. It actually looks as though controlled described participants may have taken longer, but these differences aren't significant. So this suggests that differences between conditions are also not a result of different amounts of time spent on the task. So to summarize, we find in this experiment that participants who explained the data they had seen were more likely to generate the target hypothesis than controls. We're currently analyzing the explanations and descriptions participants provided during the evidence trials to better characterize this process. We find that participants in both conditions evaluated the target hypothesis as significantly more likely than all other rules. However, the data does suggest a potential effect of explanation on hypothesis evaluation. What we conclude from these results is that explanation intervenes primarily at the level of hypothesis generation, though it may impact hypothesis evaluation as well. So now I'll talk a little bit about next steps of this work. The primary challenge raised by our results is to better understand the role that explanation might be playing in hypothesis evaluation. So to address this, we're currently running a high-powered follow-up experiment that's similar to the one presented here, with a few key changes. First, we've added rules to the evaluation task to get a more fine-grained understanding of how explainers evaluate rules that vary in their evidence and explanatory virtues. This is a screenshot from the new experiment on the right. And more importantly, we've removed the generation tasks from the experiment so that participants go directly from the evidence phase to evaluating hypotheses. This addresses a theoretical concern from the current results, which is that the hypothesis generation task might involve some amount of evaluative reasoning as well, which may have influenced people's subsequent evaluations. By removing the hypothesis generation component, we hope to better isolate any role that explanation might play in evaluation of the target and distractor rules. Moving forward, our goal is to use these results as the basis for exploring further unanswered questions about cognitive processes underlying explanation during learning. So with that, I want to thank my co-author, Karen Walker, for supporting this research, as well as everyone at the UCSD Early Learning and Cognition Lab for lots of helpful feedback throughout this process. And thank you for listening.